Welcome back, everyone, from the lunch break. Now we will start with a presentation of Ruth Levitas, who is a professor of sociology at the University of Bristol, and she's also the co-founder of the Utopian Studies Society Europe. And I'm really excited to have her here today, and we are very much looking forward to your talk, which will be then commented afterwards by Hanno Pahl. And I would like to give the floor to you now.
Thank you, Lena. In April 2020, in the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, Arundhati Roy suggested it had exposed the fault lines of the capitalist economy, and in so doing, allowed a vision of a better society, a potential new normal. She said, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. But by early 2021, at the peak of the second wave, glimpses of a qualitatively different and better way of living had given way to a race to vaccinate populations. In this paper, I concentrate on two things. One is the possibility of a post-capitalist society glimpsed through the portal of the pandemic, but elaborated through utopian thinking. The other is how far contemporary economics can be pushed in this direction, using the work of Stephanie Kelton and Mariana Mazzucato. Why utopia? Utopia in this context, and indeed in most, must be understood not as a blueprint or plan, but as a method of exploring potential alternative futures. I'm a sociologist, and my work has been in three main areas: politics and social policy, poverty, inequality, and social exclusion, and utopian studies. And my last book explores the connection between sociology and utopia, suggesting that utopia is a form of speculative sociology of the future. And using utopia to think about the future means looking at the social system and its ecological embedding as a whole system. It also allows a radical break from the present, bracketing the question of transition, and thus allowing a more comprehensive view of what needs to change. The requirement of holism reveals that there is no such thing as the economy, but a system of social practices and institutions. These can be looked at from the perspective of processes of production, distribution, and consumption, but are not separate from them. Now, this is not a cheap point that the economy is an abstraction. In the UK, we were told that the economy fell by 50% during the first lockdown in 2020. It did not. It's 35 years since Marilyn Waring wrote If Women Counted, arguing for the consideration of non-market work in national accounting. It's 25 years since the sociologist Miriam Glucksmann argued that we must think in terms of the total social organization of labor. And crude attempts have been made to quantify the contribution of unpaid work to total output. It effectively doubles the value of GDP, meaning that the economy fell by at most 25%. And not even that, for activities can move across the market-non-market boundary without any change in the actual level of work done. And quite clearly, a great deal of work moved back across the market-non-market boundary during lockdowns. Childcare and homeschooling are obvious ones. And we already know that women working from home have had to juggle new domestic obligations to a greater extent than men, and that the economic impact on women has been greater. This audience will be familiar with the shortcomings of GDP, but the wider public is not. Consequently, one of the revelations of the first lockdown was that those working in the genuinely essential services, such as refuse collectors, supermarket workers, delivery workers, care home staff, nurses, are badly paid and often on insecure contracts. We know that GDP includes activities that are damaging to people and planet, as well as many that are largely pointless. A decade ago, the New Economics Foundation tried to calculate the social value of a range of occupations compared to their market price and negative side effects. They estimated that in the UK, low-paid jobs such as childcare, hospital cleaning, and waste recycling generate between £7 and £12 in social value for every pound spent on wages. Conversely, city bankers, advertising executives, and tax accounts destroy £7, £11, and £47 of social value, respectively, for every pound they create. The pandemic very quickly exposed these and other issues, including the dependence of the economy on unnecessary spending by over-indebted people. For some, principally, of course, the more privileged who could work from home and who lived in houses with gardens near pleasant open space, lockdown also offered glimpses of an alternative way of life, while simultaneously exposing dreadful inequalities of circumstance in life and risk of death. And although the prospect of mass vaccination has closed over the rupture in the social imaginary, the challenge remains: how to develop those glimpses into a vision of an alternative social system. In Utopia's method, I outlined the principles of a sustainable, equitable, post-capitalist society. It's not necessarily a society after money, the original title for this workshop. That title calls for us to think about what money is, or perhaps more accurately, what money does. It may be a medium of exchange, a medium of communication through the price mechanism, a means of rationing, a work incentive, a vehicle of accumulation. And of course, there are alternative currencies. Robert Owen's early 19th century labor notes, which were probably the idea that informed Marx. Local currencies, local exchange trading schemes and time banks, proposals for carbon currencies and care currencies. And there's a whole debate to be had about in what sense and to what extent these alternative currencies actually constitute money. But the abolition of money and property has long been a theme of literary utopias. It's Thomas More's 1516 utopia that gave us the word itself, a pun on utopia with an E, good place, and utopia with an O, no place. The depths of More's critique of capitalism are apparent in his own preface to his outline of a different society. Book one is largely about the merits of accepting appointment as advisor to a king, but it also includes an excoriating critique of his own time, especially the social consequences of enclosures, as the profitable pursuit of rearing sheep for their valuable wool drove people off the land, plunged them into poverty, starvation, and crime, and the risk of being hung for theft. As Ellen Meiksins Wood argued, this moment of enclosure is precisely the founding moment of capitalism, as it created the landless workforce compelled to sell their labour power. Both William Morris, who produced an edition of Utopia at his Kelmscott Press and wrote a preface to it in 1893, and the Marxist critic Frederick Jameson, writing more than a century later, hailed the abolition of money and property as More's key invention. If we look closely, though, there is rationing. For although households may take what they need from the collective storehouses, it is only heads of households, all men, who can authorize this. Nearly 400 years later, Edward Bellamy's 1888 Looking Backward also attempted the abolition of money and explicitly of financial services. At one point, the main protagonist, Julian West, wonders, "What have you done with the bankers? Hung them all, perhaps?" Well, no, they have merely been abolished. West's informant observed that those who think the financial sector is the core of the economy mistake the throbbing of an abscess for the beating of the heart. In 21st century Boston, money is not used as a medium of exchange. Economic equality is imposed for all citizens, men and women, receive a statutory allocation against which they can draw for goods or services. The credits are said to be set at an ample level and very rarely exhausted. They cannot be carried over from year to year, so the virtual currency cannot be used for saving or accumulation. But if they do not act as a rationing device, why is the calculus necessary? William Morris's 1891 News from Nowhere was written as a riposte to Bellamy's state socialism. Where both Moore and Bellamy have systems of compulsory labour, Morris does not. He insists that the true incentive to useful and happy labour is and must be pleasure in the work itself. He abolishes money and rationing and any kind of calculus. Markets are merely locations for the collection and distribution of goods. Just as in the post-war years, social democracy allowed affluent countries to treat clean water, education, and healthcare as goods freely available to all, a Morrisian perspective sees no logical reason why such open access should not apply also to food, energy, or transport in a future where we shall no longer be harried and driven by the fear of starvation. A form of society built on the principle of solidarity stands as an alternative to the abstract entity of the markets. It's 10 years since I wrote Utopias Method. The principles of the new society I outlined there still stand, but they've been developed and illuminated by other people's subsequent work, and sometimes by changing public discourse. I argued then that the goals of human dignity and human flourishing depend on a much greater equality, demanding basic income and high levels of public services, good work, a radical revaluation of care, and an ethic of care that extends to care for the environment. Now, basic income has gone from being the aspiration of a few marginal eccentrics to a mainstream aspiration. In terms of after money, it is of course a transitional demand. Money is still imagined as a medium of rationing, as in Bellamy. And where it's advocated as a substitute for social security schemes, only low levels are proposed. The policy promoted by the British pressure group Compass and modelled by Stuart Lansley last month is slightly more radical. It proposes an allowance of £60 per week for each adult and £40 for each child. And we have roughly parity now between the pound and the euro, to be funded by the abolition of tax-free personal allowances. And this, he says, would be largely revenue neutral and radically distributive. But it's still quite different from a scaled up version of basic income set at a higher level, say average income, across the population, together with generous allowances for children. Lansley explicitly rejects this as too expensive and as utopian. The more utopian approach, however, can help us think more radically about the future. It's sometimes objected that the very unconditionality of basic income enables people to do nothing. But this is part of its point. It would radically improve working conditions. And doing a lot more nothing, including sleeping, would reduce resource consumption, lower stress levels, and enable better social relations. The so-called nothing that the so-called economically inactive do is in fact rarely nothing. It includes all kinds of activity, perhaps designated as unpaid work, perhaps as leisure or hobbies, such as cultivating allotments, art, music, and above all, caring. Putting care at the centre of a new society has been advocated by many, notably in attempts to substitute a care ethic for a work ethic. And it requires a complete revaluation of care and its role in social life. Care is not simply a residual category, the business of parents when their children are young, and an unfortunate necessity for the frail elderly and people with disabilities. We all need care. And this work of caring is what Marxist feminists in the 1970s and 1980s called the reproduction of labor power. All those services that enable us to get up and go to work the next day, whether it be food preparation, cleaning, washing, nurturing, and what is now termed self-care, especially as well, also the bearing and rearing of children. But if we turn that priority round and make that care that we all need, rather than the getting up and going to work, the center, pretty much everything needs to change, especially if we extend the principle of care to the environment. There's a vast literature here now, and I will mention only the Care Manifesto, written by Lynn Siegel and others, published this year, which proceeds from the universal necessity of care to a completely restructured political economy at both state and suprastate levels. Basic income would help in protecting people during the necessary restructuring of our ways of life as well, rather than trying to resurrect and hang on to all pre-existing activities and occupations, such as the hospitality industry, fast fashion, aviation, many of which are environmentally unsustainable and in large part unnecessary. To reiterate, utopian thinking here is not a blueprint or a plan, but nor is it a fantasy. It's a provisional exploration of a potential alternative future. And some people would dismiss this as unrealistic, but what is truly unrealistic is to imagine that we can continue as we are. It's necessarily provisional, for although one of the strengths of utopian thinking is that it permits a radical break from the present, that break is always incomplete. We are always conditioned by our preoccupation with the present and with the conditions we seek to change. And we are also limited by what we can imagine, given our own historical and social location. If the radical break is a stimulus to imagining the world otherwise, there is also a question of transition and some very difficult questions about political agency. As Pope Francis says, collective aspiration or dreaming together is important. It has to be a collective endeavor and not an individually thought out plan that is imposed. But we also need to wrest control of the world's wealth from the tiny minority who currently control it. Some 62, or is it now 26 individuals who hold as much wealth as 50% of the world's population. And that raises questions of power and who has power and how power can be taken. And we need to think differently about the society and the economy that we currently inhabit. And as a sociologist, therefore, it's interesting for me to explore how far modern monetary theory and critical economics might take us in this direction. And you will forgive me if this material is familiar to all of you, because I started reading this for the first time about 6 weeks ago. And I'm going to focus here on Stephanie Kelton and Mariana Mazzucato, although I think it would also be useful to consider Diane Coyle's Economics of Enough and Kate Rayworth's Donut Economics. Kelton's The Deficit Myth, I think, should be required reading for all political commentators. We are regularly told that the huge economic deficits incurred in countering the impacts of the pandemic, protecting people from starvation and supporting businesses so that they can resume normal activities, and the resulting national debts will have to be paid back. Kelton's central point is that this is simply not true. While currency users such as households, companies, local authorities, and individual countries within the euro can run out of money, currency issuers cannot. They could when currencies were tied to the gold standard, but this has not been the case for 50 years. The problem for Greece was that using the euro rather than the drachma meant it was a currency user. But currencies issued by national governments are fiat currencies, as Jan-Philipp discussed. So governments can simply issue more money. I think this is what is meant by quantitative easing. And although there are limits to printing money, they have nothing to do with the size of the deficit, but only with the potential risk of inflation. So Kelton talks about the analogy with households as myth. I would call it ideology, an account of the world that operates to disguise what is really going on. Because the deficit is mostly used as a justification for austerity, and therefore there is a political interest in this misunderstanding. Kelton also draws attention to the massive levels of inequality, arguing that living standards have barely risen in the last 4 or 5 decades because of the sequestration of assets by the rich, a process which damages the economy because it reduces both investment, a point also made by Stuart Lansley, and spending power. Kelton suggests that to counter unemployment, the state should become the employer of last resort, with a living wage payable for socially useful work in projects organized and chosen at local or community level. That is centralized funding with decentralized control and decision-making. Then people will be able to do useful things, learn new skills, and maintain their employability until private sector opportunities pick up. But Kelton also argues that governments do not need the receipts of taxation to fund spending. The function of taxation, in her view, is firstly redistributive, and secondly, a work incentive, as people need to earn money to pay taxes. And in her last chapter, Towards a Better Economy, Kelton says that the question of whether a program can be afforded needs to be thought about not in terms of money and deficits, but in terms of the real resources deployed, resources of materials, skills, and people. Now, this argument is critically important in unraveling the ideological framing of what is and is not possible, in ways that are quite congruent with the provisional utopia or transitional demands set out above. Her local job creation schemes could potentially be radical, although that depends how much local leeway there really is in relation to securing central funding and who defines what is socially useful work. But the limits come from thinking about the economy rather than society more broadly. Her notion of a healthy economy seems quite conventional, and I don't think this is just because she is trying not to frighten the horses. And although she doesn't make economic growth central to her argument, neither does she make a case against it or argue strongly for sustainability. And there is absolutely no mention of unpaid work other than in the critique of GDP. So the notion of what constitutes the economy remains intact, and the question of what constitutes socially useful work is uninterrogated. Like Kelton, Mazzucato identifies the 1970s as an important break in economic reality and accounting. That decade saw the beginning of accelerating financialization, as the financial sector managed to institutionalize the definition of their activities as productive, causing a swing from value determining price to price being taken as the measure of value. And this led to a huge rise and overvaluation of the financial sector, and meant that grossly overpaid people in that sector could claim credit for economic growth. Linked to this was the process of accelerating inequality, as noted by Kelton. In The Value of Everything, Mazzucato explores changing definitions of value and of productive and unproductive labor, argued through the history of political economy and latter-day pseudoscientific economics. She is excoriating about conventional economics based on marginal utility, as opposed to political economy, stating that, I quote, economics emerged as a discipline in large part to assert the productive primacy of the private sector, unquote. So her critique of national accounting and GDP includes its neglect of unpaid work, its inclusion of negative effects, the overvaluation of the financial sector, as well as the inflation of GDP by the inclusion of imputed rents, and a consistent undervaluing of the productive role of the state. This is a detailed analysis of the processes of financialization and their consequences, and the transformation of public goods into private goods. The core of her argument is that the creation of value is collective and needs to be at the center of economic reasoning, and that public investment is critical to the nature and direction of economic growth. Now, there is a great deal here to agree with and much to appreciate in the clarity of the argument. Her purpose, like my own, is a better future for all, to, as she says, dream of a better future and try to make it happen. She aspires to an economy with more fulfilling jobs, less pollution, better care, more equal pay, a stakeholder rather than shareholder capitalism, a new discourse on public value and the common good, and new metrics. But there are only a few passing references to the climate emergency and occasional references to some rather vague wider social that exists alongside the economy and the state. And it's perhaps this extreme vagueness about the social that explains why, despite noting that unpaid work does not figure in GDP, it does not figure in her envisioned better world either. Mazzucato's most recent book, Mission Economy, continues with the same themes, and indeed ends with the quote from Arundhati Roy with which I opened this paper. But there's no fundamental challenge to capitalism. She writes of rethinking capitalism, restructuring capitalism, doing capitalism differently, addressing our dysfunctional form of capitalism. And she writes too of putting life at the center of the economy, not the economy at the center of life. Only she doesn't. She includes some discussion of the Sustainable Development Goals. Well, SDG 5 on gender equality has 6 targets, the fourth of which is to recognize and value unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure, and social protection policies. But she doesn't consider unpaid work at all, and nor does she question the desirability of economic growth. Indeed, she says the real question is how government spending and investment can create long-term growth. Yet, as David Attenborough says, anyone who thinks infinite growth is possible on a finite planet is either mad or an economist. And if David Harvey is right that capitalism depends on 3% compound growth, a sustainable society must be a post-capitalist one. So these strands of critical economics go a long way in helping to break down the ideological defenses of predatory capitalism. But they certainly don't go far enough. They focus on the economy, rather than taking a more holistic view of a good society, our means of livelihood and means of life, and our embeddedness in the living planet that we are killing inexorably. This triad of economy, state, and society misses a large part of Glucksmann's total social organization of labor. And hence my title, There's No Such Thing as the Economy, Stupid. Kelton and Mazzucato are very far from being stupid. They are radical, visionary even, but blinkered by the very discipline they criticize. To go further, their analysis needs to be more sociological, more holistic, and more radical. Yes, indeed, more utopian.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to discussing your talk with the rest of the participants. So please, if you have questions, send them to the question collector. And while you think about that, I would like to hand over to Hanno to give his comment.
Okay, thanks. Ruth has addressed in her talk at some length the question of the framing of economic activities. So what counts as economic or productive depends on social power relations. Which variables are taken into account, for instance, or not taken into account, which causal relationships are assumed between them, which benchmarks are important, all this is neither self-evident nor simply empirically given. For my preparation of this comment, I included not only the text to which Ruth's input just referred to, but also her book, which she mentioned as well, Utopias Method, the Imaginary Reconstitution of Society, published in 2013. If you want to dig into a very substantial reflection on utopian thinking, I do highly recommend this book. I would like to focus my comment on two topics. The first aspect concerns the question of the relationship of utopias and sociology, or social science in general. This is one of the major topics of Ruth's book on Utopias Method, and it mainly concerns a look at the historical emergence and function of the doctrine of so-called value neutrality. Secondly, I will expand this question of utopias and sociology to very briefly address the relationship of utopias and simulation. As far as I can see, this relationship has rarely been addressed. Nevertheless, it is at the center of our research project on society after money. And more than this, I assume that the relationship of utopias and simulation is at the very center of contemporary science and society. Just think about the significance of formal methods and simulations in the current debates about climate change. Although these are not utopias in a strict sense, these projections aiming at middle and long-term climate effects under different regimes of carbon dioxide output influence our expectations and motivate us to act in specific directions. So I come to the first topic, utopias and sociology. We all know about so-called value neutrality, Wertfreiheit in German, most likely via Max Weber, one of the founding fathers of sociology. And we know about the value judgment controversy, Werturteilsstreit in German, in the first half of the 20th century. Value neutrality might be regarded as a building block in the constitution and consolidation of sociology as a proper scientific discipline. It functioned obviously to legitimize sociology. However, this is not the full story. In Utopias Method, Ruth discusses many examples from the early days of sociology, especially in Britain, probably a less well-known case for most of us. She makes clear that at the beginning of sociology, the question of value neutrality was highly contested. For instance, H.G. Wells, who is today famous as a science fiction author, took a different stance towards what sociology should look like. Against more positivist visions of sociology, he argued, I quote, that the creation of utopias and their exhaustive criticism is a proper and distinctive method of sociology. But H.G. Wells did not become one of the founding fathers of sociology. Max Weber did, and Emil Durkheim did, amongst others. I would also like to mention a figure like Rudolf Goldscheid from Vienna. Today, he is virtually unknown as a sociologist. If he is ever mentioned at all, then as a pioneer of fiscal sociology. But fiscal sociology never became a clear-cut field of research. The various mainstreams of economic sociology never engaged properly with questions of the state as an economic actor. In the years before World War I, Goldscheid criticized the dogma of value neutrality. These were the days of the first meetings of the Verein für Sozialpolitik, where he opposed Max Weber and Werner Sombart and argued for an explicitly political sociology that aims at political and economic reforms. He pointed out how a so-called value-neutral sociology might in fact codify the status quo and would serve the already powerful. It is important today to refer to these historical cases to ask what sociology might have become, a sort of alternate reality question, if people like Wells or Goldscheid would have become sociological classics, which they haven't. But it is not only that a certain vision of what constitutes sociology proper became dominant, one that claims to be value neutral and is anti-utopian. As Ruth has put it, although sociology may have sought to distance itself from utopia, both conventional sociology and critical sociology have unavoidable utopian characteristics. And it's not so difficult to prove this. We can look, for instance, at Max Weber's undertaking as a substantiation of a specific form of governance, a state-oriented social science seeking to discipline workers in a paternalist fashion as objects of governance. Weber was also actively engaged in arguing that socialism was impossible because private property was essential. So beneath so-called value neutrality oftentimes lurk class interests and power structures and visions of a certain normality of society. Ruth has made a similar point in her book with respect to, for instance, Emil Durkheim. The famous distinction in Durkheim's book on the social division of labor discriminates between so-called normal as opposed to abnormal or pathological forms of the division of labor. But the very idea of normality and abnormality deployed here is utopian. The normal is hypothetical and exists nowhere in reality. It is anticipatory, appealing to a better future state against which present reality can be judged. While utopian components and frames are everywhere in sociology, for the most part, this fact is suppressed and denied. We have, according to Ruth, to challenge the assumption that so-called positive and value-neutral sociology constitutes a form of legitimate knowledge, while utopianism is simply a form of speculation. Instead, we should foster variants of sociology and social theory that develop alternative possible scenarios of the future, and open up these to public debate and democratic decision. Now I will come to the second aspect I want to highlight very briefly and preliminary, and this concerns the relationship of utopia and simulation. As you have already seen in the talk given by Stefan, in our project Society After Money is Simulation, the goal is to proceed from the level of an utopian narrative and a qualitative social theory to building a formal model and a simulation. The simulation then should serve as a sort of laboratory to enable experiments we would not be able to conduct in reality, nor with only a qualitative theory. Once the simulation is ready, we hope to gain insights we probably would not have arrived at via traditional reasoning only. Simulations are artificial controlled environments, and in this respect, they contain utopian components. You might see things happening in the model world you did not expect before. But this undertaking is, in our case, not a strict linear one from utopia and theory to a formal model, but more of a back and forth process. As far as I can see in mainstream economics, there is a clear tendency of an absolutization of formal models. What is not explicitly modeled does not qualify as theory at all. the terms model and theory have in mainstream economics come quite generally to be used as interchangeable terms. If you do not engage in formal methods in economics, your work will most likely be labeled as verbal economics, and this is meant as a dismissive term, a la writing an essay is not proper economics. This brings with it the danger to exclude aspects of reality that are not so easy or straightforward to model formally. Agent-based modeling is, to the contrary, at the same time formal and very open and sort of non-deterministic. Agent-based modeling is, of course, used in many scientific fields since the 1990s, but it plays a special role in heterodox economics. So the formal models applied in mainstream economics, for the most part, do not fit heterodox approaches very well. ABM enables one to set concepts of equilibrium, production functions, types of rationality, etc., the holy cows of neoclassical economics, contingent. Actors, for instance, do not have to optimize, the system does not have to converge towards equilibrium. It is a lot more bottom-up, sort of growing explanations. Also because ABMs are not self-sufficient, but are in need of exchange with more informal theory, there's much less danger of model imperialism a la neoclassical economics. Okay, so much from my side.
Thanks, Ruth. I thought it was great. In particular, I liked your discussion of Kelton's The Deficit Myth, and I think you're right that that her book should be required reading. I wonder whether you then think so. You say that she doesn't really consider unpaid work in her job guarantee proposal. I wonder then whether you think it could be considered in that proposal, and do you think this kind of proposal could be used to pay people for work that would otherwise be unpaid?
In some instances, but I can't see how the general issue of unpaid work, which of course is spread across the population, although disproportionately the female population, I can't see how the kind of job guarantee argument would really work in relation to that. And that's why I would link it to a proposal of basic income, which means that people are not compelled to undertake paid work. And as I said, that has another knock-on effect, because if you're not compelled to undertake paid work, then jobs actually have to be reasonably pleasant and not too onerous, whereas we know that a lot of work is both unsatisfying and takes place in very difficult conditions. So possibly to some extent, but I think that there is a real problem there, which is not thinking in terms of the total social organization of labor and seeing the economy as something distinct from society. And I actually wanted, if I may, also to respond briefly to Hanno's, saying I don't know enough about formal simulation and how it would work. But my suspicion about it is that you can do mathematical simulations on economic issues, but it's much more difficult to do any kind of computerized simulation in relation to society as a whole. And that's what you have to do. Because good sociology, although it may draw on elements of calculation, is intrinsically qualitative, which was Wells's point, what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz called thick description. And I don't know how you do any kind of simulation of the kind you describe on that more comprehensive but necessarily qualitative data? So that's just a question, and it might purely be my ignorance.
Yes, great. Thank you for your talk. And I mean, I'm going to talk next, and it will actually relate to a lot of what you said. So that's great. But if I can pick up on what you just said to Hannah, actually, I mean, that's a general question that I have to you, Hannah, and actually the rest of the team, especially how to bring in all these different spheres that are now outside of economics into all kinds of models, and how to account for them. So that's maybe not to Ruth. But to Ruth, thank you so much. I'm actually, and maybe that's also a question that can be answered by other people too. You've been talking about universal basic income, but then in the UK, there is this proposal of universal basic services, which is actually an idea of like, why don't we just collectively make sure we provide for basic needs via public basic services, such as transport, food, housing, and so on, and thereby actually even escape that monetary logic of the universal basic income, but at the same time create the same kind of freedoms and liberties. And maybe in that regard also decommodify work itself. And I know that a few of the participants have written a manifesto on the decommodification of work. So maybe if people want to comment on that, because that's also relating to the presentations in the morning about the crucial power that wage labor has. How do we actually how do we have to not move away from that, and could these kinds of proposals be a step in that direction, or what other ways of decommodifying work are there? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it depends where you're starting from. I mean, at the utopian end, Morris, of course, decommodifies everything. There is no calculus. And, you know, people work because they enjoy the work that they do. And I mean, one of the objections to basic income arguments, as it were, now, and I've had this discussion actually with Anna Coote, is that people say, I'm not in favor of basic income, I'm in favor of universal basic services. Well, so am I. I'm in favor of universal basic services. And that was Morris's point, really, you know, so you could make transport and energy and everything else available free at the point of use. But transitionally, of course, that wouldn't make, I mean, we don't want everybody to be getting the same kind of food from food banks. We want people to have a measure of choice. And it seems to me that it's quite a long way down the line that you can decommodify everything and just not have any form of rationing. And I do admit that the idea of basic income is a transitional demand because it involves a level of rationing, but a level of rationing that is far more egalitarian and which should, in a way, help to decommodify work because it breaks the wage relation as the kind of fundamental relationship in society. And I agree that breaking the wage relation is absolutely fundamental to really to any reevaluation of informal care and unpaid work. So I think we're probably trying to come at the same thing, possibly from, and as I say, it depends if you're thinking about what you might do transitionally and where you want to get to at the end. And I think it may be that where we want to get to at the end is absolutely the same place.
Thank you. I have another question by Stefan, and I have another question that I just got by chat, and that's if you could go into more detail. You already said that you're not sure if you can go into more detail, but there was a question if you could go into more detail if agent-based modeling can help to investigate utopias, or you already said it's like we are more on the qualitative side than the quantitative, but maybe you can elaborate on it. And I would have Stefan asking another second question or comment.
I can't say anything about agent-based modeling because I don't know what it is and I don't know how it's done. And if anybody else can respond usefully to that, I would be very happy.
Yes, I would like to. Just give a little impression that it's not an economic simulation in the narrow sense. If I'm allowed to, just one short view on a presentation. Here you see our persons. We get it in more detail and with results later, but I just wanted to describe it. We have the needs, and we have the valuation of our living condition, our needs, our living group, production group, cooperation groups, environment, society. We're always evaluating that. And this is what we feel about our living, our emotions and our motivations, which are directed to the future. And we have priorities which base on our experiences in the past, and they relate what we want in the future. And we have degree of ego, a degree of leisure and well-being. These are only an impression that we are not dealing with the normal economic calculation. Just give you an impression.
Thank you for that, Stefan. I'm really sorry. I missed your paper this morning and the introduction to the session because I had not realized we were on a different time zone. So I missed the first hour. So I might have understood that better if I had actually seen your presentation.
I think there will be a paper tomorrow or a workshop on like the modeling. There was another question about simulation in general. If you have like about simulation and utopian thinking, if you have any impressions on that, to use simulation as a mode of utopian thinking.
Well, I think that's that's what I was saying. I'm not sure about. I mean, clearly some aspects of simulation are absolutely fundamental to understanding the problems we're trying to solve. I mean, but there are different ways of solving them. I was reading the Dasgupta review, which is a review commissioned by the UK Treasury, which basically wants to monetize everything and place a calculated value on the environment and biodiversity and so on. And I would contrast that, for example, with Kim Stanley Robinson, who is a science fiction writer, his latest book called Ministry for the Future, in which he's attempting to think through what's entailed in a transition, including things like carbon capture, but also terraforming, geoengineering. But also makes use of a carbon currency, which was part of my question. Well, our carbon, in what sense, if at all, is a carbon currency actually money? And so I mean, in a way, all utopias are simulations. They're not computer simulations, but Morris's News from Nowhere, Bellamy's Looking Backward, they are attempts to think through the whole range of changes in institutions and their relationship that would be necessary to deliver a good society. And Gilman does it. What would a society look like if you made mothering central? Marge Piercy does it in Woman on the Edge of Time, and that one is more ecological as well. And so there are simulations, but they take the form of a novel, which was H.G. Wells's point, because they're trying to describe a whole society. So the extent to which you could make that into a model that can be manipulated with a computer, or a computer game like the old Sim City, I think is problematic, because you would have to introduce some very specific elements of causality, and it wouldn't need to be kind of monocausal, but I think it would be a very complicated thing to do, and would probably end up leaving out a lot that was very important. But as I say, I really don't know enough about the simulation models, but those would be the worries I would have.